Welcome to Johnny Carson Files. On this video, it is Johnny Carson's final year on television. He has been saying goodbye for months. One last season, one last round of guests, one last chance to do the thing he had done better than anyone alive for 30 years. And on a Tuesday night in March of 1992, Elizabeth Taylor walked onto that stage for what everyone in that building understood, though no one said aloud, would be the last time. She was not well. Anyone who looked at her could see it. And what she had come to say had nothing to do with movies, nothing to do with diamonds, nothing to do with the decades of tabloid spectacle that had defined her public life. She had come to say 3 words into a microphone, 3 words she had been carrying for 29 years. And when she finally said them, Johnny Carson, the man who had kept his composure through assassinations and moon landings and the quiet unravelings of 1,000 famous lives, put his face in his hands and could not speak. The studio went silent in a way that studios almost never go silent. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of recognition, the silence of 250 people understanding, all at once, that they were witnessing something that could not be rehearsed and would never happen again. But before we get to that moment, I need to tell you what almost prevented it from happening at all. Because the story of that Tuesday night in March does not begin in 1992. It begins in 1963. And it begins with a secret that Elizabeth Taylor kept from everyone, including Johnny Carson, for nearly 3 decades. March of 1963. Elizabeth Taylor was 31 years old and the most famous woman on the planet. She had just completed filming Cleopatra in Rome, a production so catastrophically over budget that it nearly destroyed 20th Century Fox as a studio. The paparazzi had followed her every movement for 2 years. Her affair with Richard Burton had been reported in newspapers on 6 continents. The Vatican had issued a formal condemnation of her behavior. She had received death threats. She had been burned in effigy. She was in every measurable sense the most scrutinized human being alive. And she was completely alone, not in the way celebrities claim loneliness while surrounded by staff and security. Genuinely, profoundly alone in the way that only happens when the noise around you becomes so total that it swallows the sound of your own interior life. She told a close friend that year that she sometimes stood in front of mirrors in hotel rooms and could not remember what she actually thought about anything. Not her films, not her relationships, not her future. The performance of being Elizabeth Taylor had become so consuming that the person inside it had gone quiet. She had one ritual, one thing she did that was entirely private, that required nothing of her professionally and nothing of her publicly. Every weeknight, no matter what time zone she was in, no matter how late the shoots ran or how chaotic the day had been, Elizabeth Taylor watched The Tonight Show. She had started watching in 1962, the year Johnny Carson took over from Jack Paar. She watched because Johnny made her laugh. Not the reflexive social laughter of cocktail parties and premieres. Real laughter, the kind that catches you off guard, that arrives in your body before your mind has processed the joke. She watched because she told that same close friend, the only person on television, who seemed like he was actually in the room with you, like he could see you through the screen, like he had looked up from his desk and found you specifically, wherever you were sitting, and decided you were worth his full attention. That was the quality she kept trying to describe to people who asked why she watched so religiously. It was not entertainment, it was company. It was the particular warmth of someone who was genuinely glad you were there. But what nobody knew, not that close friend, not Richard Burton, not her publicist, not anyone, was that there was one specific night in the fall of 1963 when watching The Tonight Show was not a comfort. It was a lifeline. She had never told anyone what happened that night. Not in any interview, not in either of her memoirs, not in the private letters that were later archived. The secret had lived inside her for 29 years. By the time she walked onto Johnny Carson's stage in March of 1992, and the weight of it, she would later tell the producers in the green room, before the taping, had never once gotten lighter. But what you do not yet know is that Johnny Carson had his own version of that night in 1963, a version he had also never told anyone, a version that made what Elizabeth Taylor was about to say even more extraordinary than anyone in that studio could possibly understand. We are getting ahead of ourselves. Because first, you need to understand what was happening in March of 1992 and why, That particular Tuesday, that particular broadcast, had been nearly impossible to make happen at all. Johnny Carson announced his retirement from The Tonight Show on May 22nd, 1991. He would leave in May of 1992 after 30 years. The announcement hit Hollywood like a physical force. Tributes began immediately. Requests flooded in from virtually every major figure in American entertainment. Everyone wanted one last conversation with the man who had, in some meaningful sense, served as the center of the country's cultural life for 3 decades. Johnny's producers began assembling a guest list for the final season that read like the index of the 20th century. But there was one name that kept appearing on every version of the list, added by different producers working independently of each other, and then quietly removed each time anyone tried to confirm it: Elizabeth Taylor. The removal was not casual, it was deliberate, because by the fall of 1991, Elizabeth Taylor was in the fight of her life. She had been treated for addiction, had undergone spinal surgery, was managing a series of health crises that her representatives were working to keep out of the press. She was also, in her characteristically defiant fashion, running the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation at full capacity, working 18-hour days, traveling to Washington to lobby Congress, refusing to slow down in the way her doctors were insisting she must. She was 59 years old and running on something that was no longer entirely physical. Call it will, call it fury, call it the particular energy that animates people who know their time is becoming finite and refuse to waste a single hour of what remains. The people around her had learned not to argue with that energy. It had a quality to it that was not entirely of this world. Her doctor, in a private conversation with her closest assistant, said something that her assistant would not repeat publicly for years afterward. He said, "I have had patients with her diagnoses who were bedridden, and then I have Elizabeth. I do not have a medical explanation for Elizabeth." In December of 1991, Elizabeth Taylor called Johnny Carson's office directly, not her publicist, not her manager. She called herself. And when Johnny's assistant picked up, she said simply, "Tell him I need to come on the show. Tell him it's important. Tell him I have something to say to him that I should have said 30 years ago." Johnny received the message during a production meeting. His producer, Fred de Cordova, who had seen everything in 40 years of television, watched Johnny's face go through several expressions in rapid succession before settling into something Fred could not immediately read. Something between recognition and apprehension. Something that looked like a man who had been waiting for a phone call for a very long time and was not entirely sure he was ready for it to arrive. He called her back himself. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Nobody who was not in the room knows exactly what was said, but what Johnny told Fred de Cordova afterward was this: "She's coming in March. And Fred, I need you to know this one is different. This one matters more than I can explain right now." Fred had been producing The Tonight Show since 1970. He knew Johnny better than almost anyone on Earth. He had watched Johnny interview presidents and popes and rock stars and comedy legends. He had seen Johnny warm and distant and curious and guarded, and occasionally, in unguarded moments, genuinely moved. But he had never once, in more than 20 years of working alongside him, heard Johnny Carson describe a guest appearance as mattering more than he could explain. He added Elizabeth Taylor to the March schedule without asking any further questions. And for the next 3 months, neither of them mentioned her name again. The silence around the booking had a quality to it that Fred recognized from his long career. It was the silence of something that was still being processed. Something that had not yet resolved itself into words. Wait, do not miss this detail, because what you are about to learn about the week before, that taping, changes everything that follows. Everything you think you understand about why Elizabeth Taylor walked onto that stage and what it cost her to do it. The week before the taping, Elizabeth Taylor's health took a difficult turn. There were internal conversations among her team about whether the appearance should be postponed. Her doctor was consulted twice. The question was raised gently, and then less gently, about whether this was the right time to be doing live television. Her assistant, who had worked with her for 9 years, and who loved her with the particular fierce loyalty that very specific people inspire in those closest to them, sat down with her at the kitchen table of her Bel Air home 3 days before the scheduled taping and said quietly, "Elizabeth, nobody would think less of you. You could call. You could reschedule. Johnny would understand." Elizabeth Taylor looked at her assistant across the kitchen table for a long moment. Then she said, "I have been planning to say this for 29 years. I am not rescheduling." Her assistant did not say another word about it. Elizabeth Taylor's response to every question about postponement, relayed through her assistant to Fred de Cordova, was 5 words. "I am doing the show." That was the end of the conversation. She arrived at NBC Studios in Burbank on the afternoon of March 10, 1992, at 3:45 p.m., 90 minutes before call time. Her assistant was with her. Her doctor was with her. She was moving carefully the way people move when movement costs something, but she was moving with absolute purpose, and the expression on her face was not the expression of a woman who had come to be seen. It was the expression of a woman who had come to finish something. A stagehand who was near the parking area when her car arrived said afterward that he had worked at NBC for 11 years and had seen hundreds of major stars come through that entrance, but he had never seen anyone arrive the way Elizabeth Taylor arrived that afternoon. Not with glamour, not with the usual Hollywood performance of arrival, just purposeful, quiet, completely focused, like someone who had made a very long journey and could finally see the destination. The makeup artist who worked on Elizabeth Taylor that afternoon, a woman named Patricia, said afterward that Elizabeth barely spoke during the session. She sat in the chair with her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap holding something. Not a prop, not a script, just her own hands folded together as if she were bracing for something or praying toward it. At one point, Patricia asked if she was comfortable, and Elizabeth opened her eyes and looked at her in the mirror and said, "I've been carrying something for a long time. Tonight I'm going to put it down." Patricia said she did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing and kept working, and Elizabeth closed her eyes again and sat very still. There was music playing softly in the makeup room, the ambient background sound of the studio preparing for broadcast. And at one point, Patricia noticed that Elizabeth's lips were moving slightly, not singing, not speaking aloud, moving the way lips move when someone is practicing saying something to themselves, trying the words on for size one last time before the moment arrives when they must be said in public. Johnny Carson came to the green room at 4:30. This was unusual. Johnny almost never visited guests before the show. It was one of his well-known professional habits, the deliberate maintenance of a certain distance before the cameras rolled. A freshness, a genuine quality to the on-camera encounter that required not having already exhausted it backstage. His crew knew this about him. It was almost a rule, the kind of rule that accumulates around a man over 30 years of consistent behavior, until it becomes institutional knowledge, something people simply know without having been told. So when the stage manager saw Johnny walking down the corridor toward the green room at 4:30, he stopped and watched with an expression that one of the camera assistants described later as the expression of a man who has just seen a bird fly backwards. Johnny knocked twice on the green room door, opened it before anyone answered, and stood in the doorway looking at Elizabeth Taylor. She looked at him. Her doctor and her assistant quietly left the room. The door closed. What happened in that green room in the 22 minutes that followed, Johnny and Elizabeth were the only people who ever knew. The stage manager knocked twice during that time. Both times, a voice from inside, it was unclear whose, said, "Give us a moment." A production assistant stood in the corridor outside, and later said that at one point, through the closed door, she heard what she believed was laughter. Not television laughter, not performance laughter. The quiet, helpless, slightly wet laughter of two people who have been holding something in for a very long time and have finally, in private, been allowed to let it go. When the door opened, Johnny walked out first. His eyes were dry, but his jaw was set in the particular way it sets when he is containing something. Elizabeth followed him. Fred de Cordova, standing in the corridor, said later that he had been producing television for 40 years and had never seen two people walk out of a room carrying so much visible weight while moving so quietly. Neither of them looked at him. They walked in the same direction, toward the stage, without speaking. Fred stood in the corridor for a moment, and then he said, "To no one in particular, something is about to happen tonight that I don't have a category for." The show began at 5:30, exactly on schedule. Johnny's monologue was what it always was in those final months, precise and warm and perfectly timed, the instrument fully in control. A man doing the thing he had done 10,000 times with such mastery that the mastery itself had become invisible. The jokes landed. The audience laughed in all the right places. Ed McMahon laughed his enormous laugh from his chair to Johnny's left, the laugh that had become as much a part of The Tonight Show's sonic identity as the theme music. Everything looked the way it always looked. Everything felt the way it always felt. But the camera operator, who had worked The Tonight Show for 14 years, said afterward that he noticed something during the monologue that he had never seen before in all his time on the show. Johnny kept his hands folded on the desk the entire time, not gesturing, not moving, not doing the small physical punctuations of his delivery that were as characteristic as his voice. Just folded, completely still, like a man holding himself together from the inside. The first guest was a comedian who did 12 minutes of material and got his laughs. Then an actor promoting a film who was charming and easy and took up his allotted segment without demanding anything unusual from Johnny. The show moved through its paces with the smooth professional rhythm of 30 years, the machinery operating with the quiet confidence of something that has been finely calibrated over a very long time. And then, during the commercial break before the third segment, Johnny did something that the stage manager would describe in an interview 3 years later. He stood up from behind the desk. He walked to the edge of the stage. He stood there for about 30 seconds looking out at the empty area in front of the cameras, where the audience could not see him, just standing, breathing. The stage manager said he thought about asking if Johnny was all right and then decided not to. There are moments when you can see that a person is doing something private, and interrupting them would be a violation of something important. This was one of those moments, so he said nothing. And after 30 seconds, Johnny walked back to his desk. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the surface in front of him, and he was ready. Ed McMahon's voice filled the studio for the third time that evening. Ladies and gentlemen, she has spent 60 years making this world more beautiful and more honest and more alive. She is, and has always been, one of a kind. Please welcome Elizabeth Taylor. The audience rose. All 250 of them, without any prompting, without the stage manager's applause cue. They simply stood. And for the 10 seconds it took Elizabeth Taylor to walk from the curtain to the guest chair. They stood, and they did not make a sound. Not applause, not cheering, just standing. It was the particular silence of people in the presence of something they understand, however imprecisely, to be significant. Elizabeth reached the chair. She sat down carefully. Johnny leaned forward. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that was visible to everyone in that studio and to the 11 million people watching at home, though nobody could have said precisely what it was. The camera operator with 14 years on the show said he felt it through his viewfinder. A shift in the atmosphere of the room, not dramatic, not loud, just different. The way air changes before weather arrives. Johnny said Elizabeth, just her name, nothing else. As a greeting, it was almost nothing. As a sentence, it was everything. She said, "Hello, Johnny." Her voice was steady, stronger than people had expected, stronger perhaps than she had expected herself. They talked. The way they talked was different from the way guests usually talked to Johnny. There was no performance in it, no anecdotes constructed for effect, no pauses calculated for laughs. She talked about her foundation, about the AIDS crisis, about the men she had lost, the friends, the people she had loved who were gone now. Rock Hudson and so many others whose names she did not say, because saying them would take the rest of the night. And she had something specific she needed to get to. She talked about what it was like to know that your time was becoming finite, not as abstraction, but as daily fact. The way you start measuring things differently. The way the insignificant falls away, and what remains is very clear and very simple. What remains, she said, is the people. What you said to them and what you did not say. Johnny listened the way he almost never listened on television, without preparing his next question while she spoke. Just listening. His hands were folded on the desk, still. She talked about what it had meant to her, over the decades, to have a place to go at the end of the day. Not a physical place, a presence, a voice, something that was there every night without requiring anything from her in return. Something that knew nothing about the Vatican's condemnation, or the paparazzi outside her door, or the weight of being the most famous woman in the world. It just showed up, 5 nights a week, and was warm and funny and real. She paused after she said this. She looked at her hands. She said, "You have no idea what that meant." And she said it in a way that made everyone in the studio understand that she was no longer speaking in generalities. Wait, Do not miss this detail. Because what Elizabeth Taylor was doing in these first 8 minutes of the interview was not small talk. She was building towards something. Every sentence was a step in a direction only she knew. And Johnny, who had spoken to thousands of people in that chair, who could read a conversation the way a musician reads a score, who had an almost supernatural sensitivity to the architecture of what people were trying to say, knew she was building towards something. You could see it in the way he sat, the way he did not interrupt, the way his hands remained folded on the desk and did not move. He was giving her the road. He was clearing every obstacle out of her path and standing back, and letting her come toward whatever it was she had come to say, in whatever time she needed, at whatever pace she required. At 8 minutes and 40 seconds into the interview, Elizabeth Taylor paused. She looked at the audience. Then she looked at the camera. Then she looked back at Johnny. And she said, "I need to tell you something. I should have told you 30 years ago." Johnny's expression did not change, but something shifted beneath it. Something you could only see if you were watching very closely. The way the surface of water shifts before something breaks through from below. He said, "I'm listening." His voice was quiet, quieter than his usual television voice. The voice of a private person, not a host. Elizabeth Taylor took a breath that was audible through the microphone. In the fall of 1963, she said, "I was in Rome." Probably remember what was happening in Rome that fall. The world was watching. The papers were full of me, full of Richard, full of everything except what was actually happening, which was that I was the most isolated I had ever been in my life. The audience was completely still. She paused. There was one night, she continued. I won't tell you the exact date, but it was late, later than this. The city was quiet for once. No photographers outside the window, no phones ringing, just silence. I was alone in a hotel room, very alone. The way you can only be alone when there are 50 people outside your door. But none of them know who you actually are underneath what they see. She stopped. She looked at her hands again. I had been thinking about something I should not have been thinking about, she said. I won't say more than that, because I think some of you in this room already know what I mean. And I don't need to say it plainly for it to be understood. She did not say what it was. She did not need to. The studio understood. The particular silence that descended in that moment was not the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of recognition, of people understanding what was being said without it being said, of people who had their own version of a hotel room and a late hour, and thoughts that should not have been thought, of people sitting in a television studio in 1992, thinking of a night in their own lives that they had never described to anyone. The silence was full. The silence was enormous. And into that enormous silence, Elizabeth Taylor kept speaking. I turned on the television, she continued, not for any reason. Just because the silence was too large. You were on. You were doing a bit. I don't even remember what it was about. Something ordinary. Something about daily life. The kind of material you made seem effortless. The kind of observation that sounds simple until you try to do it yourself and discover how impossible simple actually is. And I laughed. She paused. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh. The real kind. The kind that gets into your ribs. The kind that makes you forget, for a few seconds, everything that was in your head before it arrived. She stopped again. And when I stopped laughing, she said, I realized I still wanted to know what was going to happen next. In my own life. I wanted to know what tomorrow was going to be. What next week was going to be. I wanted to see what was coming. Johnny Carson's eyes had closed. They stayed closed for a long moment. And when they opened, they were wet. I never told you, Elizabeth said. I never told anyone. I've been carrying that night for 29 years, Johnny. She paused. And I couldn't let you retire without telling you. Because you deserve to know. You deserve to know what you did. Even though you had no idea you were doing it. You were just doing your job. You were just being yourself. You were just being funny and warm and real at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Her voice was steady. Every word was placed carefully. The way you place something fragile on a surface you cannot quite trust. You saved my life that night. Not as a television host. Not as a celebrity doing his job. As a human being who was fully, genuinely present in a moment when a woman alone in a hotel room in Rome needed something to hold on to. She looked at him directly. Her violet eyes were wet, but her gaze did not waver. Thank you, Johnny. Those were the 3 words. Simple, direct, unadorned, and so long overdue that the weight of 29 years was fully present in each of them. Thank you, Johnny. 3 words that had been folded up and carried across 3 decades and 2 continents, and through illness and loss, and the accumulated wreckage and wonder of a life, lived at extraordinary volume. 3 words that had waited patiently through interviews and press junkets and charity galas and congressional testimony and every public and private moment in between. 3 words that had sat in the back of the mind of one of the most famous women who ever lived and waited, with the particular patience of truth, for the right moment and the right room. Johnny Carson put his face in his hands. His shoulders rose and fell once, twice. He did not make a sound. The studio was completely silent. Not one person moved. Ed McMahon, sitting to Johnny's left after 30 years, knowing every register of Johnny's composure and what it could withstand, sat absolutely still, with his hands pressed flat against his thighs. The camera operator with 14 years on the show said afterward that he held his shot without being directed to, purely on instinct, because he understood somewhere below professional training that this was not a moment to cut away from. This was the moment. This was what all 30 years of it had been leading toward, without anyone knowing it. This was the reason. He held the shot for 43 seconds. 43 seconds of live national television with America's most famous host sitting with his face in his hands, unable to speak, unable to perform, unable to be anything except exactly what he was. A human being who had just been handed something precious and devastating and impossibly true. What happened next has never been fully told until now, because after those 43 seconds, Johnny Carson lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were red. His composure was not fully restored, and he did not try to restore it. He looked at Elizabeth Taylor with an expression that everyone in that studio would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe in interviews and never quite succeeding. He said, in a voice that the microphones almost did not catch, "I need to tell you something, too." The studio held its breath. Elizabeth looked at him. Her expression was the expression of someone who has just put down a very heavy object and found, to their surprise, that the act of putting it down has left their arms strong rather than weak. Johnny said, "The fall of 1963 was one of the worst periods of my professional life. The show was only in its 2nd year. I was 38 years old, and I had taken over from Jack Parr, which meant I was following someone that half the audience adored, and the other half resented me for not being. The network was patient, but the patience had a temperature to it. You could feel how warm it was getting." He paused. "There was one night in particular. I don't remember the exact date." He almost smiled. "But I remember going into that broadcast thinking I had nothing, thinking the whole thing had gone hollow, that I was performing something I no longer believed in, that the audience could tell, and the network could tell, and everyone could tell, except me, because I was the last to know." He looked at his desk, and then something happened during the show. The audience was with me. I don't know why that night specifically. I couldn't tell you what the material was, what was different, what I did that I hadn't done the night before, but something connected, and I went home thinking, okay, one more night. Let's see what tomorrow is. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know anyone was watching who needed it. I just knew that for some reason, that night, it mattered to me that the thing I was doing was real, not performed. Real, and I thought, if it feels real to me, maybe it travels. Maybe it reaches someone." He looked at Elizabeth with an expression that was no longer that of a television host in any recognizable sense. It was the expression of one person looking at another person across a desk with absolute undefended openness. "I was saving my own life that night," he said. "And without knowing it, without either of us knowing it, we were saving each other's." The silence in the studio deepened further, which should not have been possible, given how deep it already was. Then, from somewhere near the middle of the audience, a woman began to cry. Not quietly. The sound moved through the room the way sound moves through water, in concentric rings, reaching every corner. Within 30 seconds, it had become something larger than one person crying. It had become the sound of a room full of people who had been given permission to feel something they had been holding in for the duration of the broadcast, the duration of the week, the duration of years. Ed McMahon had his hand pressed over his eyes. Several camera operators had stopped pretending they were unaffected. The stage manager, who had worked in television's 26 Verdun for 26 years and prided himself on his professional remove, was standing in the wings with his clipboard held against his chest, like something to hold on to. What Elizabeth Taylor did next was the moment that producers would later call the most unexpected thing they had ever witnessed on The Tonight Show in 30 years of broadcasting. She reached across the desk, not quickly, slowly, deliberately, the way you reach for something you have been planning to reach for a very long time. She placed her hand on top of Johnny's folded hands. Johnny looked down at her hand. He did not move for a moment. Then he turned his palm over and held it. 250 people in a television studio watched two of the most famous people in the world hold hands across a desk in complete silence, not performing, not constructing a moment for an audience. Just two people who had been carrying the same secret from opposite ends, 30 years apart, and had finally, on a Tuesday evening in March of 1992, set tenants in the same room at the same moment, with the same relief, and the gratitude that comes when something long carried is finally allowed to rest. If this story moved you, do one thing before you close this video. Think of the person who made you laugh when the room was dark, the person who was funny and warm and real at the exact moment you needed something to hold on to, the person who saved your life without knowing they were doing it. Tell them. You do not need a television studio. You do not need 29 years to pass. You just need to say the words. Because somewhere right now, someone is watching you the way Elizabeth Taylor watched Johnny Carson in the fall of 1963. They are alone in a room with the lights low and the silence too large. And what you are doing, the way you are fully, honestly, warmly present in your own life, is the thing standing between them and the dark. Let them come back someday and tell you. And when they do, turn your palm over and hold on. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because this truth is landing everywhere, and I want to know just where it finds you.